record button. All right, I haven't podcasted in 2 weeks. This is gonna be great. So welcome all you Rugrats to the 90s First, where it's a podcast that is all that and a bag of chips. My name is Mike, and I got two awesome special guests with me. First, down below me here is Cicero. Cicero, welcome to the 90s First. How you doing today?
I'm doing fantastically well. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes.
It is always the 90s First in my head.
It's always not. Yes. Oh, thank you.
So happy to be home.
All right, good. And then to my right, left on your video screen is Chris. Chris, welcome to the 90s First. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the invitation. Really appreciate it. It's always good to reconnect with my very good friend Cicero.
Yes, just a little background. We have a special episode today where these guys are actually experts in, and I'm not. So once again, very excited for them to be on the podcast. But I reached out to Cicero after listening to him on Unlocked, which is IGN's #1 Xbox show. So I'm gonna put you on the spot, Cicero. Like that. That's something that would be high on my bucket list. So how is podcasting with Ryan McCaffrey, and I think Brandon Tyrell was on that episode, right?
Brandon Tyrell was on
how was that?
It was amazing. Ryan and these guys are very much exactly who you think they are. They're very much those people in real life, and I've been lucky enough to have met them before at E3s and what have you, and also had Ryan as a guest on podcasts that I used to do, the Spawn on Me podcast. You guys should go check out that video game podcast. It's an excellent podcast hosted by Khalif Adams now. But being on Unlocked was a dream come true. It was definitely
Seriously.
high on my bucket list. I've been a fan of I've been a frequent reader of IGN since it was the Imagine Games Network and Dave Zitro and all of those guys way back in the day. So listen to Three Red Lights when that was the IGN podcast, the Xbox podcast, and of course Podcast Unlocked. So it was fantastic when Ryan messaged me and asked me to be a guest on the show. So it was great.
Dude, that would be something. I would be giddy, man. I would be a little schoolgirl, to be honest.
Oh man, I was jumping up and down with my skirt and laughing in the puddle. It was a great time. The response was great, and had I not been on there, I wouldn't be here with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, you plugged your guys' show on Unlocked, which is why I brought you guys in today. We're going to be talking about two Star Trek shows from the 90s, Deep Space Nine and Voyager. So you guys run, please, why don't Chris, why don't you chat about this? You guys run a Star Trek podcast, or at least you've been on a guest on Cicero's podcast. I don't know. Are you a co-host there?
No. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
It's Chris. Chris he has the center chair. Chris Cloud.
Chris, please plug your stuff right now. It's all about you guys right now. So what's going on?
Yeah. So the Star Trek podcast that you allude to is called Discovery Debrief, a Star Trek podcast, which is hosted by myself, by Cicero, by our good friend Zaki Hassan, and by my wife Rachel Clow. We all collaborate, and the impetus for getting together was that back in 2017. Star Trek was coming back to TV for the first time in 12 years with the premiere of Star Trek Discovery on the CBS All Access streaming service. And, I've been podcasting on a pretty regular basis since about 2009. I started at Batman on Film and have mostly stayed in sort of the comic book arena and have extended into other areas, and video games and podcasting brought me into Cicero's orbit. The very first time we met was actually meeting in person at the Chicago Comics and Entertainment Expo out here in 2014. And I always thought that Cicero was a spectacular podcaster, and he always has
he's gassing
this...
you up a little.
No, it's true though. I mean, he always approaches things from such an interestingly analytical perspective, on top of the fact that the guy just has heart. All you got to do is talk to him for 5 minutes and you know it. So when it was time to well, and I've been a Star Trek fan since before I could crawl, it seems. I've been a Star Trek fan my entire life. So when it was coming back to television, it became clear that, well, I've been podcasting for a while. There's a new Star Trek show. Time to put those things together. And so awesome. My wife was very excited to get into it with me. And then Zachy is a mutually great Star Trek fan. And I'd always seen Cicero on the periphery of Star Trek. I never really knew how into it he was before I asked him to join us for Discovery Debrief. And it became clear that he was the right man for the job. And we've been taking a little bit of a break because my wife and I just had our first child in May.
Oh, congrats. Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah. And so things got complicated, but we're going to try and get back together pretty soon to finish out the discussions related to the first season of Star Trek Picard. So it started for Discovery. CBS has been really aggressively pursuing more Star Trek content. So we're just taking a look at the future of the final frontier as a whole now.
Right. Rightly so, right? I mean, people have been clamoring for a new Star Trek show. I mean, I feel.
Yeah. I mean, so in 2005, that was when Star Trek Enterprise went off the air.
Enterprise.
Enterprise is really polarizing among Star Trek fandom, or at least it used to be. Now Discovery is the polarizing one, and Picard
I've heard things.
Right, yeah, exactly. But when Enterprise was coming out, it was a prequel show, so a lot of people thought that some of the ways that it tried to connect to the larger Star Trek canon and the shared world was questionable. I like Enterprise personally. It definitely has its hit or miss episodes, but regardless, Star Trek Nemesis came out in theaters in 2002, and that seemed to sort of signify the beginning of the end for that iteration of Star Trek, leading up to the cancellation of Nemesis and of Enterprise, excuse me. And by the time Enterprise went off the air, there had always been a Star Trek show on TV since 1987, and they had all, save for Enterprise, run 7 seasons. So, you had TNG 7 seasons, Voyager 7 seasons, DS9 7 seasons, and Enterprise 4 seasons. So you had 25 seasons of TV in 18 years. And by the time May of 2005 rolled around, for the first time since 1986, there wasn't going to be Star Trek on TV that fall. So, the movies in 2009, directed by J.J. Abrams, started, and that kind of kicked up a resurgence of some popularity for Star Trek. It actually made Star Trek weirdly popular, which I was never used to. Star Trek was always the weird thing, and I was always the weird kid for liking it. So seeing it become popular was just very strange. And then those movies kind of petered out, and then now we have Star Trek on TV with all of this streaming, the aggressive way that studios and television companies are pursuing streaming. And Star Trek is just a concept that is ripe for continuous production, and they're finally doing it.
Yeah, I think that's so cool to bring back some awesome stories. You say Discovery is polarizing. How is Picard? Like, has Picard been pretty consistent?
I mean, it's also polarizing in the sense that it seems like everybody that has taken issue with current Star Trek shows, which are led primarily by a producer and showrunner named Alex Kurtzman, who was actually a co-screenwriter on the 2009 film and its sequel in 2013. People seem to be taking issue, at least the more vocal among certain sects of fandom, seem to be taking issue with the ideological stances of the shows, but anyone who knows Star Trek knows that it has always had an outlook on humanity that says our best days are ahead of us, not behind us. Gene Roddenberry was a secular humanist. That's a big part of what he decided to push forward in the shows that he led, and that continued largely under the leadership of the people that would follow him as stewards of the Star Trek franchise. But I never feel like, except for maybe a couple of instances in the recent shows, I never feel like it's heavy-handed. It leans on the ideas of hope and of an optimistic future. Like maybe we're not all going to end up killing ourselves. Maybe we are actually going to evolve and mature as a species and accomplish everything that we're supposed to accomplish. And that's the message of Star Trek. So the way that that's been interpreted in the current shows has been kind of a subject of debate. And there are also a certain sects of fandom that just, I guess, were never really conscious of the messages of the other shows. So now they're coming into it as adults on the new shows, seeing what they're about, and they're freaking out over it. But it's always been there. So you could debate, the quality of the stories themselves, which we have done on Discovery Debrief for both Discovery and for Picard. And we'll finish Picard soon. But the fact that CBS is now finally aggressively pursuing the creation of more Star Trek in probably a more consistent way than has been seen since DS9 and Voyager were on the air, that's great for Star Trek fans. We finally have more Star Trek to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to Chris's point and kind of to the thing that you were alluding to, Mike, we also have more Star Trek to complain about. Certain fans have.
Yeah.
Right. And we were just kind of talking about that before the camera started rolling, your fandom and your appreciation for Star Wars growing up, more so than Star Trek. And it's not an either or thing for those people that are paying attention. You can love both peanut butter and jelly, guys. There is a moment where people have, like, when the credits roll on a thing that they're passionate about, they start to build. That's when the camera starts rolling in their headcanon. And so you build up your headcanon for what happens next. And when you hear about a story idea in a fandom that you're very passionate about, that's when the camera starts rolling on your headcanon for whatever that new idea is. And ultimately, if you're very passionate about it and you feel like your headcanon is the right space and the right direction to go in, you're going to be ultimately disappointed in the direction that someone else takes, because it's their headcanon. It's a collection of people's headcanon on what is going to happen in that space for the next iteration for whatever that idea happens to be. And Star Trek has been fortunate over the last 50 years, almost 60 years, to have fans that have been very passionate about its canon. So when TNG released in '86, there was a horde of people that said, "This is not my Star Trek." And then when DS9,
Picard's not my captain, that type of thing.
Exactly. When DS9 debuted in '92, you had another group of people. Oh, was that '93?
93.
It was 93. 93.
January of '93.
January of '93.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So when DS9 debuted in '93, there was another legion of people. This now gathered, the group of people that "This is not my Trek" from '86 gathered with the people from TNG to say that "This is not my Trek" for DS9. And then subsequent to DS9, Voyager got a little bit of jazz. Enterprise got a lot of heat. And then, and it was like, oh, it's not like before. And all of those things were lumped in together as "This is my Trek. The new Trek is never my Trek." And as soon as Discovery released, Enterprise became part of my Trek.
Yeah, Enterprise is the one that we love now.
Right, exactly. And then Discovery became not my Trek. Picard has gotten less of the not my Trek because the characters are my Trek. They're my Trek characters.
Yeah,
but the situations,
the
situations have started to get some of that. Especially with Picard, because I think people spent the better part of the last 35 years thinking about where Picard is, where he's going, what is happening with that cast and that with that crew. especially since I guess like Nemesis.
Yeah.
And you know where we're going to be when we see them next, and where we wound up seeing them in Picard was worlds away from what people thought that they were going to see.
Well, and just to kind of put a finer point on your point, sister. I mean, you look at the years in which each Trek show came out. You know, 66 when the original series starts. It's the era of the fanzine, right?
Sure.
And that doesn't really change up through arguably Voyager, which premiered in 95, right? Enterprise is the first Star Trek show that premieres in the age of the internet. So we're way more aware of the criticism that permeated that show. And then by 2017, when Discovery kicks in, Twitter's around. Right.
Oh yeah.
So then that just amplifies things even further. Everybody has a platform to communicate the ideas that are in their head about what constitutes truthful Star Trek. And yeah, and Cicero's absolutely right. Enterprise has now been grandfathered into truthful Star Trek in a way that Discovery is not. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, these shows are not cheap to produce. If you watch any episode of Discovery or any episode of Picard, they are on par with any big budget movie that you see. And there's only more shows that are coming. You know, they just announced a new show taking place on the original Enterprise, starring Anson Mount as Captain Christopher Pike. If it's on the level of Discovery in terms of production values, it's going to be an immensely expensive show to produce. The only reason that Netflix kicked in money to produce Discovery, because overseas, Discovery is a Netflix exclusive since CBS All Access isn't overseas. Clearly, on the side of the business that is actually choosing to make these shows, they are delivering. And that seems to communicate, at least to me, that Star Trek is very popular in its current form. And just to put another finer point on Cicero, you can like both. This is my Skywalker saber, and it's right on the same shelf with my communicator. I can assure you,
man,
that is my captain.
You're such a nerd.
That is my captain. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that Star Trek kind of has this formula of TV, and then you see Star Wars kind of going towards that formula, and for the better. I mean, The Mandalorian, in my opinion, was thoroughly amazing, and then you see them doubling down on not only The Mandalorian but other series. I think it's absolutely pivotal for Star Wars to maybe take a note from Trek and just like continue this path in TV. I think it may be for the better. So, sounds like Discovery and Picard is fun. So,
I think so. I mean, the shared universe as a concept is so popular, and you know, people wondering where their characters from one show are going to pop up in another. We're going to talk about 2 episodes where that was happening 25 years ago.
Right.
You know, the shared universe and seeing these other characters pop up in other places. Also, while movies are coming out that are referential to the things that are running on TV, Star Trek was really the first major super popular shared universe that hit multiple mediums. So to see, you know, the MCU is obviously very popular now, and Star Wars, like you said, is starting to sort of replicate that element of exploitation in terms of television and film that's conceivably going to be on an ongoing basis. Star Trek was doing that in the 90s, in the early 90s, and never really stopped. And
very well, might I add. Doing it good. So, well, let me get through some housekeeping, and then we will continue with the show. Listeners, we are over on patreon.com/the90sfirstpodcast, where we just switched everything to every single tier, getting all of our content. So you can be at the $2 level. You could even do $2.50. It doesn't matter. You will get every single piece of content, and that includes our 90s at the Movies podcast, where we have one episode on The Sandlot as of right now, uploaded to the Patreon. But me and Jelly will be recording one on Independence Day, which, by the way, don't please don't throw any eggs at me. It was my first time ever watching it, so geez. So that we will be recording this week to release this Friday, as well as you'll get weekly blog posts by me, just updates on the show and everything in between. So go ahead and check out our Patreon. Any level gets you all the content, as well as we are on Twitter and Instagram. Twitter, we're at the 90s First. On Instagram, we're at the 90s First _podcast. Please help us continue the conversation this week, especially on this new episode on Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Voyager. So without further ado, let's get into the content. We are doing a special episode. This is why I have you guys on here, because we had a community member ask us to compare The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. However, we switched it a little bit because The Next Generation is obviously an 80s show, technically, when it started. So we decided to do Deep Space Nine and The Voyager, which, I'm very happy to do, because I think first and foremost, there's a very good contrast between these two shows that, I think we'll talk about here. But let's get into a segment we like to call Nostalgia Lane. Guys, I didn't grow up watching these two shows, so, if you guys have any awesome memories, just like any memories whatsoever, maybe hanging out with your brothers, sisters, I don't know if you have siblings, maybe your parents at all, just watching this, what types of good memories, good vibes do you have surrounding both Deep Space Nine and the Voyager?
I'll defer to Chris first.
All right. If you're sure. Yeah. I mean, I've got nothing but good memories when it comes to thinking back on Star Trek. I mean, the 90s was such a heyday for the franchise, and I was born the same year that Next Generation premiered. I was born in 87, so I was pretty young when the shows were first on the air. My into Star Trek was really through my dad and through my brother. My older brother's a huge Next Gen fan. He would watch it all the time on Bakersfield, KPU, ZZ. And, as the new shows were coming out, because we grew up in Southern California. And so when it started to become clear that another show was coming out, DS9 premiering in January of 93, I was pretty young, but I do remember my brother being very excited for that show coming out. And he ravenously consumed it, but then he became a teenager and just kind of fell off. And when he fell off, I kind of did too. But I was more focused on, I guess, TOS. TOS is probably my favorite Star Trek show, but it's not the best one. I wouldn't actually absorb DS9 in its entirety until I was in college. And after I watched the entirety of that show, that's when I realized this is the best Star Trek show. But when I was a kid, too, a couple of years later, Voyager is going to be leading on UPN. UPN was the Paramount network at the time, basically. So Voyager was going to be a show that would help kick it into gear. And I remember being excited about it, even though I was only about 6 years old. The idea of, like, being back on a starship was really cool, and the fact that the series was going to have the first female captain ever turned a lot of heads at the time. I think Kate Mulgrew was even on the cover of TV Guide, like right before the series premiered. So it was a big deal, not the least of which because it was leading a network. So, but looking at both of these episodes was a big practice in contrast, which I know that we'll get into later. But the intent of both of the episodes are very different too. And I think one of the reasons as a kid I had a hard time getting into DS9 was because its subject matter was inherently darker. And I think that is gleaned in the first episode.
Yeah. So for me, I'm older than both of you guys. I was born in the 70s, so I remember the 80s quite well. But for me, DS9, definitely struck a nerve because we were going to have our very first Black American lead in Star Trek. And so with
and we'll get into this, but he's Avery Brooks is amazing as the captain. Amazing.
So and America First probably became familiar with him with a show called Spencer for Hire, and then that was so successful, or his portrayal on that show was so successful that he had a spin-off show called A Man Called Hawk for his character, and then getting to see him go into sci-fi and the most optimistic sci-fi in Star Trek was something that I was very excited about. However, it hit at the exact same time that I was getting ready to go off to college. So when DS9 premiered, I remember watching the premiere, but not much of the series itself. Jumping in and out, and then obviously being a college freshman and ensuing college career, you can't make appointment television anymore. So I wound up missing it in its initial run, and wound up catching it really in its entirety just this year. I finished actually
Really?
the series, yeah. And as Chris says, DS9, like I understood fundamentally what DS9 was about, but being able to binge it and watch it in its entirety, it's objectively the best. Objectively talking about something that's subjective, objectively saying that DS9 is the best Star Trek. So not only was it great because it was such a definitive departure from all of the shows that preceded it and proceeded it in most ways. In the fact that it was serial in nature. If we look at the way TV is done, episodic TV is done, you've got serials. You think of like a daytime soap, or think of Game of Thrones or something to that effect. Versus procedural. Think of the A-Team or Knight Rider, or any of your favorite, shows, or any of the other Star Treks, where you've got your cast of characters. Their subplots will advance their character development in very particular ways, but at the end of the episode, you hit the reset button and you start anew on the next in the next episode. And DS9 was very, very different from that, and the premiere definitely shows you that the focus is on characters, as opposed to the characters in the location, as opposed to exploration. And that is something that was very jarring for Star Trek fans. It seemed kind of apocryphal, or hypocritical, or just what heretical, I guess, is the right word for a Star Trek fan to not be going anywhere when they're watching Star Trek. But that show was great. And then DS9, same thing. I actually watched on Netflix. I watched all of the series in reverse. So I started with Enterprise, and then I went to Voyager, then I went to DS9. Now I'm on TNG, and I'll probably hit the animated series again, and then I'll go back to TOS again. But the thing with Voyager was it kind of it was the attempt to right some of the wrongs that were brought along by DS9. They knew that Paramount knew they had a great show with DS9, but they wanted to give Star Trek fans that Star Trek fix of ship out in space doing things again and again. And you really got to see a sense of where those things were going to happen in those premiere episodes from these two different series.
Yeah. And we'll get into it further with that, but yeah, I think there's stark differences between DS9 and Voyager. For me, I grew up just watching the original show with my dad, and kind of what you were talking about, Cicero, is that like the original show, it had those moments of like not feeling like it was a true series. Like you would watch through an episode and it almost have like a slight amount of character development. I mean, how much character development do you get in Spock anyway? But you know, I don't know.
And you know what?
I might need to watch Discovery, because isn't he in Discovery?
What I'll say that Chris would say is, or what Chris would be too modest to say is, I would say listen to Discovery Debrief, and you get a sense of just how much character development you can get from someone, or emotional depth you can get from someone who is not supposed to display their emotions. I won't even say that they don't have emotions.
Well, and I was watching, I started watching The Next Generation again today, and I was on the 3rd episode with the Contaminant, and Data even shows some like emotions. Absolutely. And it's like, okay, like, you know, and he's not supposed to, but yeah, I grew up watching Captain Kirk, Spock, Doc, you know, all those guys just, just going on some crazy adventures. And I remember those sci-fi adventures. I remember them being fantastic storytelling. And I was going to get into this a little bit, but I'll get into it now. I grew up also watching The Twilight Zone, and a lot of similarities between at least the original series and Twilight Zone in story, in the way that, you know, it captures some of its science fiction and the way the storytelling is portrayed. Like, I love the comparison kind of between those two, and that I think that's why I was drawn to Star Trek, because, you know, I'm a horror film guy, and loving the Twilight Zone, Star Trek kind of had some of those horror film episodes, at least here and there, which is like, really cool.
It's all about the allegory, right?
Yeah.
You know, so you know, Twilight Zone was just it. I mean, it was Rod Serling making fables, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of what a lot of what we got in Star Trek, especially in TOS, was mirrored in comics in the X-Men, with, you know, creating these allegories for American life right now. And looking and creating these stories that we couldn't, you know, I couldn't come out and tell you that it's not okay to hate someone just because they're a Soviet, but I can put a Soviet on the bridge of this space, you know, of this spaceship set in the future, and we can all coexist. I can't tell you that, you know, I can't have a story where I tell you that it's okay for a black man and a white woman, or a white man and a black woman, to be together, but I can show you an episode where Captain Kirk kisses Uhura. And you know, and like, and those things, they become okay because, like Rod Serling understood and Gene Roddenberry understood, that your entertainment is one of the ways that you can reach the public in meaningful ways, and they use that platform to help advance society as a whole.
Yeah, and that's what I think what makes, you know, the original series so special, in many ways. You just get fantastic stories, and then, you know, that personally led to watching the movies. You know, I remember, I think it was like 2014, maybe a little bit earlier, I bought all the movies in one Blu-ray set, and watching some of those updated graphics was just amazing to me. And just reliving some of those memories, watching some of those movies with my dad. You know, the first time I watched Wrath of Khan was with my dad, and, you know, that movie's a classic. It's regarded as one of the best, and you guys could probably argue me on that, but it's so good. So yeah, those are the memories that I had. Anything else you guys have with Nostalgia Lane? Any other cool memories?
I just, so I what I'll say is, you know, it's not to be understated, and I'm sure that Rachel, who's a little bit younger, may have very definitive feelings about Janeway in this way, but I grew up in a small town right outside of New York City. Most of the people that lived in my town were black. I went to a black high school, and even like nerds are nerds are nerds, and those dynamics in high school exist, despite the cultural differences and what have you. But there was, even amongst the cooler kids and the nerd set who didn't necessarily pay attention to Star Trek, weren't big Star Trek fans, but were fans of television. Were very excited at the fact that Avery Brooks was going to be on TV, and we were going to see black people in the future, because the Jetsons, a famous television show,
Wow, yeah,
had no black people. There were no black people in the future, right? The Flintstones had no black people on there, and except for Sammy Davis Jr. Rock, or whatever his name was. Like, he was the only one. So there were no black people in the past. So to actually get to see a black person in the future, and he's in command, did a lot. It did a lot. And so I mean, it was always a sense of pride from that perspective, but also being able to watch his journey over the course of that series. Pride doesn't really even properly encapsulate the feeling that you have about that character and that portrayal.
I think that's such a wonderful perspective, and thank you for sharing, because you just don't think about those when you're white. I'll just be honest. So so thank you for sharing that. It really means a lot. No, Chris, I cut you off.
No. I mean, I since the show started in 93 and I was pretty young, I certainly didn't understand the profundity of that, especially being a white kid in Southern California, in a town that was probably 90% white, not even exaggerating. But I will say, in a totally innocuous note, being a kid in the 90s and being a Star Trek fan was the last good time to get good Star Trek toys. And I took full advantage of that.
Oh, there you go. See, I was born in 92, so I'm younger than both of you. And our first episode of the 90s first was on the Batman animated series. That's what I grew up collecting, those action figures. So
well, yeah, you're speaking my language too. I mean, in terms of my all-time favorite characters in fiction, it's probably Bruce Wayne and Spock.
Really?
And I mean, I could tell you more about the development that Spock did go through in the original series, but I'll say
That's all right. You could school me on another podcast. Maybe when I binge Picard, you'll have me on there and just.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and move on to the topic of the show. We deep dive. We call this the All That Chat. Do you guys remember the All That? Do you guys remember All That? Yep. So we call this the All That Chat. All right, guys. So we are going to be comparing the two, but first I wanted to kind of deep dive into them separately, if you guys don't mind. And obviously, let's start with the first show that came out, which was Deep Space Nine. And just really quickly, I do have the IMDb pulled up here. Here we go. In the vicinity of the liberated planet of Bajor, the Federation space station Deep Space Nine guards the opening of a stable wormhole to the far side of the galaxy. It does star Avery Brooks as Captain Benjamin Sisko, Rene Auberjonois. Auberjonois. Okay, I knew Chris would correct me. As Odo, we got Cyril Laughlin as Jake Sisko, which is the son. You got Alexander Siddig as Dr. Bashir, Colm Meaney as Chief Miles O'Brien, Major Kira is by Nina Visitor, and I loved her character, by the way, in this first episode. So, and we got some others as well. You got Armin Shimmerman as Quark. So, guys, first, let's just get your overall thoughts. We're talking just the first episode as a whole. Right. Chris, what do you got on the first episode of Deep Space Nine? Like, what?
I mean, Star Trek pilots are really interesting when looking at them in isolation from the rest of the shows, because they really do have a lot of power in establishing the tone, and they're all very different. You know, you could compare The Cage to Encounter at Farpoint, totally different shows. By that same token, Encounter at Farpoint to this show, Emissary, totally different shows. And one of the brilliant strokes to me for really sort of reaching and trying to grab at the heart of the audience, conceivably an audience made up significantly of fans of The Next Generation, you go back to one of the most defining moments of the entire run of The Next Generation, a show that wasn't even finished yet, and it was still a defining moment in TNG's run, and that is the assimilation of Captain Picard to become Locutus of Borg. And he is forced to use his knowledge and experience as a Starfleet commander for decades against his own people in a massive attack that results in the deaths of countless thousands, 39 starships of 40 destroyed in a defensive against a single Borg cube. And learning that this Starfleet officer, Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Sisko, was on one of those ships and is a direct victim of the Borg and Locutus's onslaught specifically. It's a really excellent way to get people's attention, because all of a sudden the lead of your new show has antagonistic, justifiably antagonistic feelings to the lead of the show that you already watch, that you probably like a lot. And so by positioning the initial conflict of this first episode as between now Commander Benjamin Sisko and Captain Picard, in that very first and tense exchange between those two, it sets the tone for a show that aims to be, I mean, darker is probably a word that's overused when it comes to DS9, but there is no mistake that the aim of a lot of the storytelling in DS9 is darker when compared to The Next Generation. TNG is kind of the pinnacle of optimistic Star Trek. It's exploratory, it's fun, it even gets a little bit campy in places. And one really key example that subverted those expectations was the two-parter where Captain Picard gets assimilated. So by using that and applying it to the show that makes a statement about what this new series is going to be is kind of a stroke of genius as far as I'm concerned. And that's before you even get into all of the really interesting and dynamic character choices that they made for the key cast. Not only do you bring over someone from Next Generation to sort of fill the engineer role in Chief O'Brien, but you also have someone who, for all intents and purposes, was a terrorist, who has now taken up the uniform and the authority of a provisional government that's trying to rebuild after 50 years of oppression and subjugation at the hands of the Cardassians. And I'm talking, of course, about Major Kira. And she brings a dynamic all her own that is in unique conflict with the authority that Sisko brings to the table. But Sisko also has, even though he has a lot of boiling rage when you first see him talking to Captain Picard, he also has this sort of tempered understanding for what Kira just went through. And then you have the sort of whimsical campiness of the capitalist run amok in Quark. And then you're also introduced to Odo, and you're not really sure what to make of him. He just is really gruff. And of course, you know, there's very little foreshadowing to the entire journey that he goes across in the entire series. But the population of characters in DS9 that you get to connect with in the very first episode, it's a far more even like ideologically diverse cast of characters than you got from the other shows. And it just creates a scenario that is undeniably interesting for this first step.
And you feel for most of those characters, right? You kind of connect with them in the first episode on a deep level. Like you said, Kira, right? She's going through all this stuff before this episode even happens, and then you see that rage that she has kind of towards the Kardashians and all that, and you kind of connect with her. You feel her pain that her home has been somewhat oppressed for many years.
She oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'll just real fast. She feels a chance, like she feels weirdly more optimistic about the potential for freedom that is represented by this, but she's also wary of the authority of the Federation and coming in and taking over this rickety old Cardassian space station. And all of that is sort of framed in another device that I think is really, really pivotal in this first episode, and that's the fact that Sisko is a single father. You know, his son is going with him on this journey, potentially a dangerous one, but their entire family was upended several years ago, and now he's trying to make the most of it to the point where he gets this crappy assignment for all intents and purposes and doesn't want to put his son through it. And it's only after this first episode, of course, that he comes to a different conclusion.
Yeah, the brilliance of DS9 is that it creates a roadmap for the remainder of its run in that first two-parter for its characters, not even the situation, and not even setting up. We're going to talk about Voyager, and Voyager basically set up its roadmap of being quantum leap in space in its first episode, but what we have for DS9 is it's very much a character driven story where they set up so much of what is going to happen over the next 7 seasons. Establishes it right away. Odo talking about, hey, I need to go into that wormhole and figure out what's going on over there because I don't know who I am. I've been forced to live amongst you and pretend to be who I am. Talking about Major Kira and her very complex and complicated, relationship with ousting one set of occupiers and welcoming in a new set of occupiers, begrudgingly, and having, and feeling like, okay, well, these guys are benevolent, so I'm okay with that, but I'm not okay with that because I just want us to be free. And being able to empathize with that character, we get introduced to a whole new species in Jadzia Dax with her character and understanding that her relationship with Sisko from previous, because she's a Trill and she's got a worm, a symbiote inside of her, and that symbiote contains the memories of all of its past hosts, and that's something that gets established right away, and you understand that there's so much there with that. The person who gets the least amount of character development is probably O'Brien, but even in that first two-parter, you probably seen O'Brien do more significant things in these 2 episodes than you had seen in the previous 5 seasons collectively, almost from TNG. So it was a breath of fresh air for that character, and you got to see so many of these other characters, and not the least of which is Gul Dukat, who plays a role in the very first episode, and his bearing on the entire series, but most importantly, Ben Sisko being named the emissary that for which the title of the episodes are, that he means something. Like, this all didn't happen. This didn't just happen by chance. That maybe it was predestined that Benjamin Sisko wind up in taking this really crappy post, because he's meant to be there. And over the course of the series, you discover why that is important. And all of those things and how they intertwine is part of the brilliance of the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to what Cicero said when it comes to Dukat, it's kind of a crime, at least, as a Star Trek nerd like me would naturally think, that DS9 is not nearly as ubiquitous in the culture as other shows in the franchise are, because everybody, rightfully so, but everybody brings up Khan as an example of, the ultimate Star Trek villain. Watch DS9, you realize pretty quickly that Dukat is the guy. Like, Dukat and Khan are clearly the two core key Star Trek villains, but Khan only appeared in total in the entirety of the franchise 3 times, one of which was a reimagining in 2013.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Dukat, by total contrast, appears in all 7 seasons of DS9. He is given the time to develop as a truly fascinating and even far more despicable antagonist over the course of that entire series, and the way that he's performed and the way that he's used across the show is I can't even describe adequately how perfect a villain Gul Dukat is. He is a terrific foil for Sisko and for the rest of the crew, and Kira probably has even more heated confrontations with Dukat over the course of the series than even Sisko does. But the fact that he means so many different things to our different members of the cast, it really emphasizes just how brilliant a villain Dukat really is. And this is in light of all of the other foes that the crew is going to face over the course of the series. Even in light of the massive threat that the Dominion comes to represent in DS9, it always comes back to Dukat. And even Dukat's like part of the Dominion, but he eventually becomes a villain unto himself, separate from every other active facet of DS9. And it's also just like from a cosmological perspective, DS9 provides arguably the greatest look at what it's like to exist in the Star Trek universe. Being on a starship out in the fringes of the final frontier is one thing, but actually seeing what this show does in terms of world building is invaluable to the rest of the universe. And even though Star Trek at large is an optimistic franchise, DS9 really, outside of maybe some current examples, is the only series in the franchise that challenges what it means to be optimistic. Because it's easy to be a saint in paradise, which is, I think, something they even said on the show. But when that is challenged, you have to justify why those are ideals in the first place, and DS9 does that.
And that's what makes this show, at least, again, I've never watched the series, but the first episode I could tell alone that it's going to be special. Because you have that difference from the Star Treks that have preceded it. It's not a ship going where none have gone before, but, boldly exploring space, basically. And it's a place where, and you could tell this in the first episode, is a place where you're going to start to really care for these characters. You're going to start seeing their character development, and you're going to truly enjoy watching this. And I agree with you guys. I want more of Dukat. Like, this was literally only the first episode. I'm thankful that you guys have informed me that he's in all 7 seasons. So I'm pretty excited. He's a good villain overall, even in this first episode alone. There's really no Star Trek talk. Maybe no Star Trek podcast without chatting about the captain. So, what do you think about Ben Sisko? Is he one of the better captains in all of the series? Like, but like, do you like him as a character in this particular show? Do you think that his story in this first episode was impactful to you? What do you think about the captain?
Well, so I'll just say that I was incredibly disappointed with Avery Brooks's performance. The writing that was handled for Benjamin Sisko, it was completely unrealistic, and I didn't empathize with him at all. Obviously, I'm joking. So Commander Sisko, he spoiler alert, he has to wait a little while before he gets that 4th pip. and becomes a captain, but he does become a captain, and that's a wrong.
Excuse
that's
my
one
ignorance.
yeah. So that is one of a couple of wrongs that the show committed, that they righted through the course of their series, with regards to Avery Brooks as an actor and Benjamin Sisko as a character. But in I guess in retrospect, you can find some benefit from the maturation and the evolution of the character as a result of that. But I mean, obviously, right off the bat, the fact that this captain or this commander looks like me meant something to me. And then to see his relationship with his son, which again is something that plays throughout the course of this series and plays better in this series than it does anywhere else in Trek, that relationship. But you know, not only did that resonate with me, but there was a level of tenderness there that humanized my experiences to the rest of the world. That meant a lot to me, and it meant something to me then. It means 100% more to me now. It means, you know, infinitely more to me now as an adult, as someone being able to view it again with the wisdom and the pain of my own experiences in life. And, you know, like as you're sitting around, as you were describing, Mike, how eager you were to look forward to going forward and checking out the rest of the series, it made me think of Star Wars. As a kid, when I grew up, you know, I saw Empire and Jedi in the theater. Well, I saw all three of the original trilogy in the theater. I didn't see A New Hope in '77, but it got a long run in the theater, as successful movies were wont to do back in those days. So I did get to see A New Hope in the theater, and saw Empire and Jedi in the theater, and I loved those movies because they were great, and it was action, and it was sci-fi, it was all the things that I love. But my favorite movie was Jedi, because it had, not only did it have a Death Star run in it, but it also had Ewoks, which were awesome, and Luke had a green lightsaber. Then my second favorite film was A New Hope, because it had it had lightsaber battles and all this other stuff, and it also had the Death Star run, and those were the things that were exciting. And Empire was fine, but it wasn't my favorite at that time. And then, of course, as I grew older and I've gained more experiences, and I had the understanding of patience and nuance, and and being able to grasp those things as an adult, of course, the right answer is that Empire is the better of those three films, because it adds those human elements. It doesn't try and distract you from the story with all of these action set pieces. It just focuses on the story and helping you build an understanding and a level of familiarity with those characters, and allowing you to connect with those characters in a way, and dealing with some of the tragedy, because that's something that we can all resonate with and empathize with. DS9 does the same thing. DS9, and that's, I think it's great that you're able to sit and watch it now as an adult, versus watching it when you were younger, when you had an idea of what Star Trek was. Star Trek was on the ship, and you're exploring, you do the thing, you see the crazy alien, right? Now you're able to actually be able to appreciate a version of Star Trek where it's set in the future, but it's a human drama set in the future with humans and aliens and wormholes and ethereal religious iconography, but like, you can appreciate all that stuff now, and DS9 delivers all of that stuff in spades.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I totally agree with everything that Cicero said. When it comes to taking kind of a holistic look at the entirety of the franchise, obviously, it's the captain that sets the tone for what the show is going to be. And each show takes a very different kind of approach to who is going to be serving in a leadership position. So, you know, Captain Kirk, kind of a lovable rogue, but he still ultimately believes in the authority that he represents as a Starfleet commander. But he has more willingness to break the rules where necessary if he thinks more good can be accomplished that way. Captain Picard is almost defined more by his restraint than his action, because he's the head of the Federation flagship, a ship that's obviously extraordinarily physically powerful, but that is also supposed to sort of represent the freedom and peace that the Federation is supposed to be, and it tries to project that image to the rest of the galaxy. That's why the Enterprise is on the front lines and exploring as much as possible. It's an exploratory vessel first, but if it needs to show its teeth, it can, and usually does. But Picard is very much a diplomat. He is the one who is fashioned to be the go-to guy if you need someone to make first contact with a new alien species or try and facilitate negotiation between two belligerent powers. He's the guy that serves that role extremely effectively. And one of the fascinating things of TNG is that you find out over the course of the show that he didn't start that way. That's something that he developed into. Then when you come to Sisko, right out of the gate in this first episode, he is a guy who seems to be defined by an anger and resentment that comes from a very understandable place. What his career seems to have taken from him by this point far more than it has given him. And then it's only over the course of this episode when he understands that he has a unique sense of insight into the environment that DS9 operates in, and the increased strategic significance that the station takes on once the wormhole is discovered. He thinks that he can make a difference, and when he's given the opportunity to make that difference, he jumps at the opportunity to do so. Later on, the series kind of takes a little bit of a different tact with him, in the sense that as a Starfleet captain later, he still tries to exemplify the ideals of the Federation, but he is also I think anyway, at least in terms of my understanding, the only captain who thinks that challenging those ideals is the best possible way to reinforce them when they're confronted with an existential threat, which is what the Dominion War will come to represent for the Federation at the end of the series. So when I think of Sisko in comparison with the other captains, the first thing that I think of, it's not restricted to the first episode, but in the series as a whole, he's the toughest of everybody. And that's by necessity. He's the only wartime captain in the entirety of the Star Trek franchise. So you need him to have that sort of intense strategic understanding of what the Federation's supposed to bring to the table in wartime. But also, too, he's not so tough that when confronted with brutality, he doesn't try to address it and fix it. And he also still wants to project the kind of optimism and leadership that he thinks his son will need. So Sisko really is so multi-dimensional, especially in comparison to the captains that we had before. And I love Captain Kirk, I love Captain Picard, but they weren't forced to confront nearly as many different kinds of problems as Captain Sisko had to confront. So you see, very much like a real person, several different sides of Sisko at different times, because he has to react to different stimuli and apply the best possible solution for the situation that's in front of him. And sometimes that doesn't work out very well. And sometimes he has to compromise a little bit too much in order to be able to see tomorrow. But at the end of the day, the total result of that is probably the single most fascinating captain in the entirety of the franchise.
Man, you guys just want to take over? Just go ahead. Just
like, we spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, right.
Which is why I asked you guys to come on board. Once again, just delighted that you guys are here, because your expertise is something I can never achieve, especially in Star Trek. Talk about sports. I could do that.
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised if you stick with it. You will develop these thoughts. I promise you.
Okay. Well, I do plan on sticking with it. Let's move on to the other 90s show really quick to talk about its scope, as well as just the first episode, its captain as well. Again, this is Star Trek Voyager. So really quickly, let me read the bumper for that here. It says, pulled to the far side of the galaxy where the Federation is 75 years away at maximum warp speed, a Starfleet ship must cooperate with Maquis rebels to find a way home. So you had Deep Space Nine, which is basically this sandbox, Cicero said, this like soap opera found in just one spaceship set next to a wormhole, just one, scene, basically, one setting. Now we're moving back to a ship that is boldly going where no man has gone before. And in this case, we have a new captain. First time a woman is a captain, which is really cool as well. But I guess maybe since you guys were around and I was 4 years old, maybe 6 years old, what was the response to switching back to sort of the same formula that the original as well as Next Generation was going to?
It was a sense of, we're bringing the franchise home. It seemed like that was kind of the predominant idea that they wanted to push forward with it. For those people, and admittedly I was among them, who thought that Deep Space Nine was too much of a departure from the trekking in Star Trek, by putting the crew on a ship again, even if it wasn't the Enterprise, you still had the exploratory element back. But the enticing element of Voyager was that it was supposed to be taking that core concept and just pumping as many steroids into it as possible, because not only are they exploring, but they have no sense of backup, no organizational structure behind them, no star bases to restock their munitions or their supplies.
That doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, when you have replicators, right? I mean, that's one of the things that they even play with in the show. It's not like a starship has to load up gallons and gallons of water, right? It just makes it in the snap of a finger. But, I mean, that just conceptually, that was one of the things that Voyager was trying to, quote-unquote, return to. How successful it was at doing that is up for debate, and a lot of Star Trek fans have debated that quite a lot. Personally speaking, Voyager is my least favorite of all of the Star Trek shows. It is still Star Trek, though, so it's still going to be better than a lot of other shows, just by the very nature of the franchise it's attached to. And I do have a lot of affection for Voyager in general, but it definitely got weird in places. That's for sure.
Even a little weird in this first episode. Cicero, what you got?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that Chris alluded to earlier on was how much crossovers and the expanded universe and extended universe play, or Star Trek plays with those tools. And almost kind of created those tools, or at least created a blueprint that the Marvels and the current Star Treks and lots of different television shows, the Arrowverse, have played with in very, very real ways, as a result of seeing how successful Star Trek was with both establishing a setup for the premise for a premiere, but also giving a level of authenticity to the new show. Like, this is in very much in the same way that Captain Picard's presence on DS9 was kind of like the blessing, was the handing off of the baton to a new show. DS9 did the exact same thing with Voyager, where it literally launched from Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
And if
yeah, I saw the
DS9
episode. I was like, I know that shit.
Right, exactly. So like if you and in fact they used the DS9 score when they were showing the station, but like if you were a fan of Deep Space Nine, you were familiar with the Maquis. You were familiar with the trouble that the Maquis was causing for the Federation, the Cardassians, and the Bajorans in that space. So like there was already a level of authenticity with what was going on there, and then to see the formation of this crew that you'll wind up using throughout the rest of that series was great to see, but very much in a very different way than we got with DS9, where DS9 was like, hey, we will bring everybody together and we're going to spend a lot of our time dropping really subtle but concrete hints about the character makeups of our principal characters here. And we're going to explore that throughout the course of this series. We got very little of that, I think, in terms of, or maybe we got the same level of it, but the characters in Voyager may not be quite as deep. The journeys, the character journeys on that show aren't necessarily as pronounced. They're definitely not as pronounced as they are on DS9, but that is, it's kind of a secondary or tertiary aspect of that series, with the exception of the EMH, the emergency medical hologram, and then of course subsequent later on in the series, what the series is known for is the appearance of a reclaimed Borg that goes by the name of 7 of 9 in this cat suit, and that was kind of one of the things that show had been known for, but like I wasn't necessarily being glib by calling it Quantum Leap in space, because that's kind of what it is. I'm sorry, this is that's an 80s show, so maybe, but the point is, like, I'm trying to get home, accident happens, I can't get, I'm pushed far away from home, I'm trying to get home, how do I get home? So maybe a more apt reference for the 90s would be Sliders, but like, so every episode is going to be my quest to see how I can find my way back home. Yeah. And they did a good job of establishing that. I love the Doctor from Voyager. I love Captain Janeway. Like Chris said, it probably is my least favorite Star Trek show, but you're a sports fan, Mike. You've got your favorite teams, but there is a hierarchy even amongst your favorite teams, right? If all of your favorite teams were playing on TV at the same time, you would tune into one first, yep, right? And that's your favorite. And then, like, once you've made sure you checked out all the stuff on the other ones, at the you'll check in on the last guys. You still love them, but they're not at the top of the list. And Voyager just happens to be there. Everybody's got to have one, right? So Voyager happens to be that one, but there is lots of great amongst, even my least favorite team.
In case you were wondering, that'd be the White Sox at the very bottom of the
list. And they have earned that position, sir.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe this is because of my ignorance, as with DS9, but Voyager felt more like home for me, particularly with Star Trek. It was a ship, a crew on that ship with an established captain, and an established crew around her, and they go on this journey to find a ship where what's his name, a Vulcan spy was on. His name was Tuvok. There you go. Yeah. Tim Russ's Tuvok, who was a spy on another ship, and he gets lost. Voyager goes and voyages and finds them, and they get whisked away, basically 75,000 years, 75 light years away from home. And as you're saying, and now it seems like these episodic adventures are going to be, how do we get home? How do we get home? And I think that's probably the appeal of Deep Space Nine more, is that they're not necessarily on a mission, but rather they could focus on, protecting their Deep Space Nine, ship, their home, basically. And then you can have stories surrounding that and the character development surrounding that. But I almost liked the first episode of Voyager more, just because I felt at home in the Star Trek universe for myself.
You're not alone, Mike, in that feeling. And I think there was definitely a sense of relief when Voyager was announced, and then when Voyager premiered, because as Chris said, there was Trek in your Star Trek again. Yeah. At that point, TNG had already ended, and so we were watching DS9 as Star Trek for a very short period of time between TNG ending and DS9. Oh no, I guess how many years was it, Chris? 6 years? 3 years?
I'm sorry, for
between TNG ending and Voyager beginning.
87 and 94, and Voyager premiered in 95.
In 95, yeah. So there you go. So yeah, so it was a short period of time. So there was trekking again in your Star Trek, and that makes sense. If especially if your exposure to Star Trek has been TOS, some movies, an episode, a double episode of DS9, and a double episode of Voyager. One of those things is not like the other, and it's just that it's just the double episode of DS9. So I mean that makes sense, definitely.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I think I liked the characters of DS9 a little bit better than some that are portrayed in Voyager. But yeah, the story felt right to me, at least in the first episode there. Yeah. Chris, are you chomping at the bit to say something here?
No. I mean, when I think back on Caretaker, I guess the thing that just kind of falls flat for me is that in comparison with some of the other first episodes of Star Trek, it doesn't have as unique a sense of its own identity. That being said, what takes place in Caretaker does a really good job of setting up what the status quo is for Voyager and the entire series going forward. And it's also something that gets returned to several times over the course of the series, where you have either a disgruntled crew member or some enemy that recharacterizes what happened to Voyager that sent them into the Delta Quadrant, and Janeway has to revisit the choice that she made in stranding the crew there. So in that respect, I appreciate Caretaker, and I think that it's a good show. And Captain Janeway is an awesome character, and she just becomes more awesome as time goes on. When you understand more about the totality of her journey and what ultimately led her into command. I mean, she started as a scientist and uses her keen understanding of science as a way to inform the way that she does command a starship. And then she's also, of course, given just this impossible situation of having to manage and preserve a command structure that doesn't have the weight of an organization behind it. That's a unique circumstance for a Starfleet captain to be in. And there are also other episodes over the course of the series where she still observes that structure so closely that she has to sort of even follow classified missions that are captain specific, thousands of light years away from any possible backup that she could have that could represent an existential threat to the galaxy as a whole. I mean, there are some really interesting elements of Voyager over the course of the entire 7 seasons, and Janeway, in some respects, I think she's better than the show she's on in a lot of ways.
Wow, yeah.
So, I mean, I love Captain Janeway. She is easily the most fascinating character, and I think that part of that, again, it goes back to that sense of unique identity. It seemed like Chakotay was they were trying to sort of model him off of Sisko, but they ultimately didn't really take him anywhere very interesting, and the biggest critic of Chakotay and where they took him over the course of the show was the man who played him. Robert Beltran is very open about what they did with his character and what they didn't do with his character, and
Chakotay
where they
he was the captain of that smaller ship, right?
Right,
yeah,
exactly. With the markings or the tattoo on his face.
With the
Okay.
he was the Maquis leader. That and that's an interesting element too, because as Cicero said, you become familiar with the Maquis going back to DS9 and in Next Generation. The Maquis plays a pretty big part at the end of Next Generation, and having to unite two crews that have totally disparate missions does create sort of a sense of tension between the crew members, and it goes to some pretty interesting places.
That is true.
That first episode, though, I don't revisit it as much as other Star Trek pilots, just because in comparison with the other ones, it just seems a little bit by the numbers. But that's not taking away from the fact that it does what it intends to do very effectively, and it's something that's revisited multiple times over the course of the series.
I think it's also interesting, and maybe you guys can sound off on this, but they added another Vulcan, right? And kind of obviously you're going to have initial comparisons to Spock, and this is the first Vulcan as a second in command, basically, right? Since Spock, right? Or is he not second in command?
He's not second in command. He is part of Janeway's inner circle. But he is not a number one. He is not a Spock analog necessarily. And to be honest, throughout the course of the series, I think there is less that you can use to compare Spock to Tuvok. I don't even know if it would be an apt comparison to compare Spock to Tuvok outside of their race. Okay. The fact that they're both Vulcans, and I think that they were aware of that when they were creating the character. But I think they did a really good job of making Tuvok unique, and making his character unique, and kind of subverting this expectation that he was going to be very Spock-like. Tuvok
is a character that I really enjoy. He doesn't have much on Spock.
No, not at all.
Because, one of the things that makes Spock such a fascinating character is that he is half human and half Vulcan. So he has a side of his lineage that embraces emotion, constantly in conflict with the side of his lineage that suppresses it. That's the source of a great deal of advancement for the Spock character, not just in the original series, but in the movies and other appearances that we would see.
Wait, he has character development? Wait, really?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm just messing with you, Chris. I'm just
I
messing.
know. No, it's all good. But I mean, Tuvok has no such conflict at the core of his being. But that being said, Tuvok does represent something that becomes very pivotal for the balance of the crew, and that is that reliance on the equation aspect. And the thing that makes Tuvok even more fundamentally different from Spock is that Tuvok is a tactical officer. You know, he's not a scientist. He's someone who knows by design far more about. I mean, he was a scientist in his early career, but as the tactical officer aboard Voyager, it's his business to know more about the firepower that the ship has in comparison with its ability to scan a gaseous anomaly, you know. So Tuvok brings a very tactical element that is, at least in his idea, in the best case, divorced from the emotional element. It's very different, let's say, than from Worf as a tactical officer, who is almost defined by his passion and what he brings to that. But Tuvok is also just an interesting character because he's very long-lived. There's a really interesting third season episode of Voyager that actually goes back to his earliest assignment in Starfleet, which was aboard the USS Excelsior under Captain Sulu. So we actually get to see Captain Sulu in action a little bit from a different angle than we saw him in Star Trek VI. And you start to learn a little bit more about the sort of concessions that Tuvok understandably gives up to succeed in Starfleet. And the rest of the series, he's just reliable. He's always there. And there's a certain comfort level that Tuvok brings when you know that he's the one that will back up a member of the crew. Tuvok, even though he's not a warm and fuzzy character, there is something that is just very comforting about his reliable presence and what he brings to the table in that respect. And that's why I find it really hard to dislike Tuvok. I don't know how someone could actively dislike Tuvok just because, you know, the logic and the earnestness that he brings to the table on top of the fact that he's just a badass is... Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
That's one of the coolest things about him.
Yeah, no, I really like him as a character, and I think you guys hit the nail on the head. It's because he is a Vulcan that is different than Spock. I think you kind of get this sense that he, even though he's not going to show emotion, he kind of has that fierceness about him. At least in this first episode alone. And as you said, he's a tactical officer, and he just knows a lot about the enemy, knows what's going to happen basically. And you know, Spock rightfully so did have some of those moments as well. But I love Tuvok. I like his character a lot. He's a good addition to at least the Voyager. Anything else on the Voyager? Maybe specifically like story elements of that first episode. You said you really didn't care too much about the caretaker, right, Chris?
Yeah, I mean the thing that I just kind of go back to when it comes to the episode as a whole is that, like I said before, it does its job effectively of getting the crew so far from what they know. I mean, on paper, that seems to communicate, wow, this is really a Star Trek that wants to go where no one has gone before. How well it actively accomplishes that promise, maybe it's not fair to the first episode, but it kind of retroactively colors my perceptions of the first episode because there's not a ton of overarching new ground that's broken over the course of the next 7 years. I mean, Cicero alluded to what Voyager is primarily known for in terms of some of the characters that it would introduce later and some of the places that it goes. But the best Voyager episodes really kind of take the concept and push it forward into something that had not really ever been seen before. Like, I'm a big fan of the Year of Hell two-parter later on in the series, because that it makes the ship and the people on it confront what it means to die and to try and come to an effective end as much as they possibly can to try and make a difference against an implacable foe. There's another episode it's arguably one of the most cynical Star Trek episodes that has ever been created, where you find out that the crew as a whole and the ship has actually been copied and aren't really the Voyager crew, and they're dying, and there's no trace of their existence at all by the time they're trying to make it to Voyager, to the real Voyager, for help. But before it can get there, everything just breaks down, everybody dies, and no one can tell that something was even there. And then when the real Voyager comes and scans the little cloud of dust that's there, they can't tell what it was. And it's just like, oh my God, this is extremely dour and dark for a Star Trek show. So you can't say that that's not new ground that it tried to break, but not quite in the direction I'd want to go to. But no, Voyager, it's an interesting show, and the first episode does a good job of sort of setting the table for what it's going to be. But in comparison with other first Star Trek episodes, it just doesn't seem to carve it. It leans so much into the fact that, look, we're on a ship again, and we're exploring what's really unknown because no one else is around, and we can't get backup and all this other stuff. It leans so far into that there's almost not enough room to make enough of a declarative statement about how it's going to set itself apart from what we've seen before, at least in my opinion.
What's funny is when I was watching the caretaker again, was it caregiver or the caretaker? It's the
caretaker.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's a moment in there where Harry Kim and B'Elanna Torres are on they're about to be on the planet and in the White Room. They're but right before that, Kim wakes up as he's about to be probed, and that is, I sat there and I guffawed at that moment, because if you've watched the series, or as you watch the series, you realize that that's a trope. Harry Kim is the Kenny, is South Park's Kenny of Voyager.
Oh, no.
Where
I really like
yes,
this character.
Exactly. Yes. But so they don't kill him per se, or do they?
But he's the guinea pig.
but he is the, if something bad is going to happen to the crew,
oh man,
I can guarantee you 8 times out of 10 that it happens to Harry Kim first.
And he never gets a promotion over the entirety of the 7 years.
The entirety of the series, yeah.
Man, that's rough.
So yeah, but I think one of the contrasts that we can draw from these two series, and you know what, and what's kind of brilliant is the fact that you had to pick these two series as opposed to picking TNG and DS9, is that the contrast or the contrast between them couldn't be more stark, in terms of DS9 started in its premiere episode or episodes, set up the setting, establish the setting, but also establish that each and every character that you'll be following has something about them that you will want to discover, that there is more to, this onion that needs to be peeled away.
They're not just going to be a butt of the joke, that type of thing.
Right. But and Voyager said, all right, well, our characters, yes, our cast are characters, and you will get some development of them, but the real character is space and the adventures and the ship and all of that other stuff. And so while there is depth for those characters, and there is nuance to those characters, their archetypes are are clearly defined, and they kind of live through those archetypes through most of the series. Neelix is the plucky, pesty, kind of, sometimes useful companion, as he is in the first episode. Tuvok very much is a stoic, pragmatic Vulcan, tactical Vulcan. Janeway does has some depth to her, but Chakotay is very much kind of combative, kind of says what he has to say, but is also like that the Starfleet in him does come out over the course of every episode, and so you can see that it's right for him to be the second in command. And Torres is like, she's angry and fiery, but she takes no gruff, and that's kind of who she is. And Tom Paris is a little bit of a womanizer. There was the moment we are introduced to Tom Paris and he's on his way to Voyager, that moment where he is very swarmy towards the pilot that is flying him in the shuttlecraft up to Voyager, and I'm sitting there like, wow, that's a cringeworthy moment that wouldn't play well on 2020 television. And I'm glad that we're beyond that, where she just had to ignore his advances and give him some sarcastic one-liner to kind of tell him to fall back. But those characters are pretty much who, like, if we had to paint them as archetypes, they're pretty much who they are in that first episode, by the time we get to the 150th episode.
And that is a really pivotal point too, because honestly, like, if I have to give the credit where it's due, this episode, Caretaker, is arguably far more watchable than the TNG pilot is. The thing is, like, so as I said before, Caretaker doesn't do enough, in my opinion, to sort of set its own identity for itself. That being said, that's mostly just in terms of concept, because Encounter at Farpoint, the first episode of The Next Generation, it's more that the novelty of Star Trek on TV has returned. The characters are very different at the end of TNG when compared to where they are when you meet them in the beginning. And they are, frankly, not as interesting. And you can't say that about Caretaker and Voyager, because, as Cicero said, everybody is very consistently portrayed throughout the entirety of the 7 years. That might indicate a degree of arrested development with those characters in comparison with The Next Generation. But still, there is that kind of sense of episodic reliability that you get over the course of the entirety of Voyager that the other shows didn't have. And there are some multi-part stories in Voyager, but for the most part it is a pretty straight episodic show, very much unlike Deep Space Nine. Very much like The Next Generation, but TNG still seemed to have an allowance for more active individual development of the characters, and even the core cast changed a couple of times over the course of that series. But Voyager was very consistent, save for one example that brought in arguably its most fascinating character. And she's the most fascinating character for the reasons that you don't think would make her the most fascinating character in 7 of 9. So it's easier for me to watch Caretaker. And I don't want to contend because I don't think that it's a bad episode. It's a good episode. It's a good Star Trek episode. It's just when I compare them retrospectively and compare it with the other first Star Trek episodes, it just doesn't stand out as much. That's where my grievances, if you can even call them that, probably lie.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, it's an entertaining watch. It brings you on as Cicero said, it brings you on a trek once again to just space that is uncharted, space that is unknown, and you kind of get this sci-fi story that, it starts developing some characters, but yeah, you don't get that feeling that you do. You don't get the connection that you do, at least to the characters in Deep Space Nine. I think that the characters in Deep Space Nine make that episode great, that first episode. As far as watchability, I think the Voyager first episode may be a little bit better, but from what you guys are saying, I'm thoroughly excited to trek, no pun intended, into the rest of or maybe the pun was intended, into the rest of the series, especially in Deep Space Nine, just because of how highly praised you have been given that cast and that series. I mean, Chris, you even said that it's probably your favorite series out of all the Star Trek.
Well, I think it's the best one. My favorite one is still the original.
Okay.
But, for very different reasons. So I separate the two in that respect, but I can't deny the greatness of DS9. I can't even try with a straight face. And anyone who's seen it can't even try. So...
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I concur. I would definitely recommend Mike watching both series because, like we said, even less great Trek is still great Trek.
Yeah,
and there is lots to show. As Chris talked about with 7 of 9, this is a character that is still 3.5 seasons away from debuting on the series based on the episode that you watched, and she's a great character, and the development of her character through the remainder of that series is phenomenal. So much so that she is part of the pantheon of great Star Trek characters, to the point where she was in Picard. She was a major get in Star Trek Picard. But my favorite character of that series and the arc that I enjoy the most is not even a person in the emergency medical hologram. The EMH program is a character that was kind of an afterthought in that episode. You realize that you're going to be with him for a bit because, here they are 75,000 light years or 75 years at maximum warp away from home and in the Gamma Quadrant, and they have no doctor, and they're going to have to use this program that is set up to do that in an emergency.
Yeah, they literally got so lucky somebody invented that,
Well, and that's something that's explored on the show too.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
And I have to Cicero brought it up, but I do have to backpedal on something that I just said, because if there is a single exception to all of the characters that you encounter in the first episode and where they are at the end of the series, the Doctor is a totally different character, and it makes perfect sense why he is the one that has developed the most. And that's because he basically developed sentience. He developed his own personality. He developed ways that he could set himself apart from every other fake Doctor that's installed on board a starship, because the necessity is that he becomes a part of the crew, and then he becomes a part of the family. So the Doctor is definitely one of the more fascinating characters in the entirety of the franchise, and he's certainly one of the absolutely most fascinating characters on this show, and indications are that we will be seeing him again very soon.
Ooh.
Yeah, there you go.
Sound excited.
There you go.
Well, any other thoughts on either of the first episodes? I mean, I think we covered it really well.
The only thought that I have is one that I share to as many people as I can every day that I can, and that is just watch more Star Trek. It's a great franchise. There's plenty of room in the fandom. Come on in, give it a shot, check it out. If you haven't really given it the time of day before, maybe consider giving it another look, because there are so many different dimensions across its entire history. Several different TV series across different decades, all trying to say different things at different times to try and appeal to people in the moments in which they live. And then you have a legacy of 13 films of varying quality, but most of them are pretty good. And they tend to go in different directions than the TV shows do. And there's only more Star Trek to come, and I'm so happy that I could say that now, because for a long time, the people who own Star Trek didn't really seem to care all that much about it and weren't giving it resources, and thankfully that's not the case anymore, at least for the moment. So come on into Star Trek. There's plenty of room, and the water's fine.
Oh, thanks for having me. Oh man. I've had a blast talking about Star Trek with you both. Once again, thank you for joining on the podcast. We like to end the podcast with, what have you been up to? Like anything. Video games? Have you been reading books? Have you been watching movies? I mean, obviously you guys maybe have been watching Star Trek, but what else have you been up to? Like, let us know about you.
Who's well, all right, then I will go first. So what have I been up to? I just bought a house, so moving.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, so unpacking. I've been up to a lot of that, and I've also been let's see, sheltering in place, and not because I'm quarantined, but because it's the right thing to do. And when I go out, I'm also wearing my mask. Also because it's the right thing to do. We're all in this together, and that kind of goes back to Star Trek. It goes back to understanding that it is easy to be a saint in paradise, but when the times get rough, how we treat our fellow human is more telling of who we are as people than how we act in the good times. And that is part of Gene Roddenberry's vision. It's part of the vision that I think has been carried on into the 80s, the 90s with these two series that we saw today, or that we discussed today, and even today with today's Trek. So it is definitely a part of my life and a part of the way that I view the world. But more fun stuff. I've been podcasting, like you saw me on Unlocked. I was recently on an episode of Jeff Kanata's podcast with Christian Spicer, DLC. I will be hosting this week on a podcast network that I'm part of, the Incomparable Network, at the Incomparable on Twitter, a review panel for Spike Lee's latest movie, The Five Bloods. That's on Netflix. Spoiler alert, I liked it very, very much. So you guys can stay tuned to my channels to see when that is actually published and out and ready for consumption. But yeah, outside of that, it's just working, being a dad and a partner, and trying to love life and spread as much joy as I possibly can to all the boys and girls.
I like that. Chris, what have you been up to, man?
Outside of trying to acclimatize to being a dad, I mean, that's taking up a lot of time. But I mean,
how old is your baby so far?
2 months as of a couple days ago.
Wow! So, oh my goodness, so you got a long way to go.
Tell me about it.
Chris, you got that wrong. She's 8 weeks.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
No, you're right.
She's 8 weeks.
You're right. Yeah, I get. Yeah. See, I can't even get that part right.
You can't start counting months until after a year.
Oh, that's the benchmark. Okay.
Right. So at a year, you start counting months, and then you can be an annoying parent and keep counting months after 3 years old.
Okay.
Because there are those people that are out there.
I didn't know that there were these many rules attached to it.
Oh, listen, brother. You don't get a rule book. There's no instruction manual. But every parent is willing to offer up this advice for free, even if you don't want it. And so here is your unwanted advice of the day. It is weeks until a year. It's months until 2 years. For most people. Some people take it to 3 years, and then there are those that shall not be named that will say that their children are 58 months.
Okay, all right.
All right.
Or I could just say I'm 390 months, right? Is that what something I could do?
Whoa.
Right.
Guys, this is my podcast. I need to lay down the law here.
I'm sorry. Anyway.
I have an 8-month-old, and I call him 8 months. I don't do the math, bro. I'm not doing the math.
Right.
So feel free to do 2 months, Chris.
Yeah, I didn't know that math.
That's 33 weeks, Mike.
I didn't know math was going to enter into the equation until they're old enough to do homework. I mean, come on. But
it's highly illogical, Kevin.
But in terms of other stuff, I mean, I'm a big comic book fan, and Matt, you know, if you're
I saw that.
fan,
I saw that on Twitter. You run a podcast that does like gaming and comics, right? Or is it a new project coming up?
Well, I got a couple. So I've got a comic book reading podcast with my friend and longtime co-hosting partner, Paul Herman. It's just called The Comic Binge, and basically what we do is we try and go into the comic book streaming apps, so DC Universe, Marvel Unlimited, Comixology Unlimited, and just pick out a story to read. We tell people what it is ahead of time, and then they can listen to Paul and I talk about it. So we actually just released an episode of that show today where we just kind of talk about what we've been up to. And then the next time we get together to record, we're going to be talking about the beginning of Marv Wolfman and George Perez's run on New Teen Titans from the 80s. It was a series that I read a while ago, but I haven't read it in several years, so going to be revisiting that with Paul, and that should be fun. If you're a fan of Batman the Animated Series, then I highly recommend Batman The Adventures Continue, written by Paul Dini and Alan Burnett, and it's effectively a continuation of the animated series, and the art style is even in the way that the animated series itself was rendered by Bruce Timm. So that's a highly recommended series. I'm a big Superman fan, so I'm reading a fair amount of Brian Michael Bendis' current run on Superman, trying to get caught up on that. And then odds and ends here and there. Big comic book fan. But I also do have a comic book video game podcast called Comics on Consoles, where I basically try and examine comic book related video games. And it's been a while since I released a major full episode of that show. But I did recently release a couple of smaller scale backup features, is what I'm calling them. One was about the Iron Man VR demo that dropped in May, I think. And then the other one was just sort of a review and discussion of the 2018 Spider-Man game released for the PlayStation 4.
I just beat that game, and man, I loved it.
Yeah, it's a solid game. It's very solid.
Best game of the generation for me.
Oh, really? Well, you're taking it that far?
Best game of the generation.
Wow. Well,
I don't. So I'm a dad of two, and I just don't get much gaming in outside of my Apex Legends and Call of Duty or something like that. So finishing Spider-Man was a miracle.
It emphasizes how much you love it.
Yeah, that's an endorsement on how great it is, and as part of the reason. Sorry to turn this into the Spider-Man love fest, but like part of the reason that it's the best game of the generation for me is its level of accessibility, right? Where it sets its rules, it shows you how to play, you understand the learning curve, right, or the meta of like, much in the same way that I felt like Batman in the Arkham series. Spider-Man, once I start playing Spider-Man as if I am Spider-Man, it like that game clicks and it works for me.
Oh yeah.
And then it never gets so difficult that it becomes frustrating for someone who only has 2 hours to game in a night. And so you can go in and you say, all right, I can play this game for an hour or 2 hours, and I can accomplish something without getting frustrated, and I can move the story along and have fun with this game. And so not only is it accessible in that way, but the story is great, and the score is great, and what you have to do is great, and it looks phenomenal, and you feel like the character that you're supposed to embody, and all of those things come together in a way that I don't think any other game in this generation has been able to match. I
actually did just finish a New Game Plus playthrough on Ultimate Difficulty, so I have 100%ed all of the trophies in that game.
There you go. Most platinum game on PlayStation Network.
I can believe that.
AAA game.
Sure, yeah, and I can absolutely believe that. Game. So we released an episode where I reviewed it, and then with my friend Paul, we sort of talk over it because Spider-Man is his favorite superhero ever. So that was a fun thing to do. I did just get the full Iron Man VR game, and I've been playing it here and there. I think it's terrific so far, especially considering that they finished it under some pretty difficult circumstances. It got delayed indefinitely because of the pandemic, and it looked like we didn't know when it was going to come out, and then they just finally released it this past Friday. And it's good so far. And I'm also, for shame, but I had never played The Last of Us, and I just finished the first game, and I started the second one. So
it's not shame. I've never even played it. So.
It's really good. I mean, in the first game, I don't know how widespread an opinion this is, but I kind of don't like the guy you play as. He's kind of a jerk, Joel. And it's hard to sort of empathize with him in a couple of key places outside of some suffering that he's gone through in the beginning of it. And then the second game just takes a different tact with the story, at least with what I've played so far. So, I mean, they definitely put a lot of time and energy and polish into it, and it is a very emotionally resonant story, but it is kind of a story about a compromised world that's just full of compromised people. And so that kind of makes it a little hard for me to get into some of the characters outside of maybe Ellie in the first game. But but they're really good games, and they're worth playing, and just the polish that they have makes them worth checking out all on their own. So that's kind of what I've been up to: comics, video games, and fathering. You know,
fathering.
Interesting combination.
Well, if you need some tips, I have a 3-year-old and a 8-month-old, so I got your back.
I need tips. I promise you. I need
tips. So I've been packing because we're getting ready to sell our house and move to something bigger. Speaking of the two kids, our kitchen, if my wife's cooking and I'm in the kitchen and then my 8-month-old is just crawling everywhere and then my 3-year-old comes in, we have no room. So we're just like, we need a bigger house. So we're getting everything ready. Got some promising houses to look at. We're looking at some on Tuesday. So
man, that's got to be tough doing all of that in the middle of everything going on right now.
Thankfully, our county is lighter. I mean, you guys are in the Chicagoland area. Currently we only have, last time I read, 18 active cases of COVID versus I can only assume in the hundreds for Chicagoland. But yeah, I mean, it's right now is a seller's market, so we're trying to pounce on it.
Right. Because, exactly. Strike while the iron's hot.
Yeah. So yeah, doing that. I've been collecting some retro consoles. I'm a small streamer on Twitch, so I've been collecting some retro consoles. I just bought a GameCube.
Nice.
Yeah, so got some.
You gonna be playing some Super Mario Sunshine?
No, I'm gonna wait for the Switch re-release. I'm banking on that actually happening.
Okay. I hope it happens. I've been waiting for a remaster of the Metroid Prime trilogy now for. How old am I? For about that long, it seems. So we'll see what happens.
So yeah, I just got a GameCube. A community member of mine sent me an Xbox 360 to play some older games on that as well. So yeah, and then I'm a huge into battle royales. That's what I mainly stream. So Apex Legends, Warzone, I've been playing those. Been playing. I'm trying to create a series for my YouTube channel on some of the older Maddens, because that's what I grew up playing. Sports games were my life growing up. So I actually collected every single Madden up until Madden 13, because I have EA access on my Xbox, so I could just get the newest ones for the Xbox One for free off there. So yeah, just planning all that stuff. Haven't been reading any comics. Comics are expensive. I don't know how you do it, Chris. I just don't know. Don't know how.
Well, I used to be a retailer, so I worked about 6.5 years behind the counter at a comic book store. So I'm a big believer in local comic book stores. But for a lot of people, if the monetary side of it is a big issue, and it's understandable because cover prices have only gone up and up and up in the last several years. Look into DC Universe and look into Marvel Unlimited, because it's a great way to absorb a back catalog of stuff at a much lower price point.
Yeah. No, I agree.
And DC Universe is a great app, and it doesn't seem like it gets a ton of attention. I mean, the only reason I sign up for it is for the comics that it has in the back catalog, and they're great. If you're a DC guy, then yeah, it's solid.
I'm more of a Marvel guy.
Okay,
probably.
Marvel Unlimited is really solid too. I mean, it's the catalogs between the two are pretty complementary, like in terms of just the sheer content that they have, but some really great stuff there.
Yeah. And then last but not least, my wife and I started watching Hamilton last night on Disney Plus.
Nice.
So pretty excited to finish that. We only got to the intermission just because we're parents and we are tired. So,
of course.
You guys got anything else to share?
Let's see. I've got things to plug.
Go ahead.
Should I be sharing those? I guess. So a thing to plug would be that Hamilton was phenomenal. I just finished watching it today for the very first time, so that was great. So I'm excited for you guys. But as I said, check out The Incomparable real soon, or just check me out at Stubby Stan on Twitter, and you can. If you follow me, then I will. I'm sure that I'll likely post where I'll be next, or where you can hear me next or see me next. I also want to shout out my castmates over at Rivals of Waterdeep. That is an actual play tabletop role-playing game hosted or on WotC on the Wizard of the Coast actual D&D channel. I am a member of the cast, but I'm not on this season. So taking a little bit of a break because I was moving and life gets in the way, blah, blah, blah. But if you guys are D&D fans, or if you're looking to see if you can get into D&D and you want to check out a stream, you can definitely check us out on twitch.tv/DND every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Twitch.tv/DND, Rivals of Waterdeep. Check us out on Twitter at Rivals Waterdeep, or on your favorite podcatcher, just put in Rivals of Waterdeep. We're there. And we're also, our videos, our VODs are available on YouTube. I believe they're on the, if you just put in the search thing for Rivals of Waterdeep, you'll get,
You'll find it.
Yeah. So, that's it for the stuff besides our captain of our bridge crew, DSC Debrief, Discovery Debrief, Chris Clow. I'll leave that to you.
Thank you very much, my friend. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested in checking out Discovery Debrief, check us out on Twitter at DSC Debrief. You can find us on pretty much any major app that you absorb your favorite podcasts on. Happy to welcome new people to the fold. And one of these days, Cicero and I are going to have to get on Star Trek Bridge Crew and play that game with some people, because I think that would be fun.
There you go.
In terms of my own stuff, you can find me on Twitter at Chris Clow, CHRISCLOW. I tweet random thoughts about comics, movies, video games, what have you. And then you can check out my comic book video game podcast, Comics on Consoles, at its website, comicsonconsoles.com. And I also post occasional things that I work on just at my own website, which is bychrisclow.com. I have a bunch of video game and movie reviews on there if you're interested in checking out more of that stuff. And looking forward to getting back into the debrief mold with my friend Cicero.
Awesome, guys. Well, once again, thank you guys for joining me for this trek of a podcast. This is the longest podcast I've ever recorded, and I'm thankful for you guys' expertise. No need to apologize. I love it. I love podcasting. It's something that I always wanted to get into, and just starting out, it's been a blast so far. So once again, thank you guys for joining me. This is the 90s First. We'll see you guys later. Have a good night.